For this episode of the Cedar Log, we have audio that was taken at the 1963 NOAC, where Dr. Goodman gave his famous speech, Higher Vision. We would like to thank Dr. Sirkin for sharing this audio with us. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
I want no spotlight on me while I talk to you, brothers. I want to be able to look you in the eye. You see, long ago my grandmother taught me not to shoot till I see the whites of their eyes. It's been a great conference, but I expected a great conference. I always do expect a great conference when I come to one of these shindigs, and I know you do too. And I want to express my personal congratulations to those young men and older young men that have made it all possible. I'm speaking under some difficulty at this moment because I'm not yet over the effect of this combination of the Brotherhood Chorus and the Brotherhood Band. It's almost too much for me. I wonder if you appreciate what a miracle of music has happened here in the last few days. Now, I can speak with some authority because for some years I was the chairman of the board of a conservatory of music and arts, and I know what it takes. And never have I heard of such carrying on in the field of music as has happened here in these two great musical units in our conference in the University of Illinois. But that is emblematic, I think, of the whole program of the conference. We have met together in the spirit of brotherhood and cheerful service, and we have demonstrated that in the way we have carried on. I wish I had time to express to everyone, in addition to Bob and Jerry, the chief and vice chief of this great conference, and George File and the committee of advisors. I wish I had time to mention everybody by name, but it's been a great experience, hasn't it? Now, whether it is really a great conference, however, will depend upon what happens when we go back home. To make this higher vision come true in our hometown, in our home lodge, in our home areas and region. That's what will make it a truly great conference. And I have every confidence to believe, my brothers, that is going to happen. Now, some things I wanted to tell you in this little message, this closing message to you, come out of an experience that Mrs. Goodman and I have had in the last 7 or 8 months in going around the world. There's always a danger in approaching such a story. A neighbor of mine in Vermont, when he greeted me on my return, said, "You know, I have another friend that recently came back, and I heard of his return from a long trip around the world, and I mentioned the fact to another neighbor. And the neighbor said, 'Yes, I heard Jim had just got back, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rush over there as soon as I can before he has time to develop those bloomin' slides of his.'" And I knew what he was talking about, because it's so easy to go on and on. But I thought you'd be interested to know how the Order of the Arrow, the news about the Order of the Arrow, has gotten around the world. Let me mention a few instances of that. As we pulled out of the Pacific Harbor at Vancouver on our trip, I was fortunate enough to stand beside a lovely young lady. Now, when you leave the dock, it's always an emotional affair if you're going all the way across the Pacific. But I was standing right beside her. I should tell you that her husband was on the other side of her. And naturally, we began talking. My wife was on the other side of me. We began talking and got acquainted while we were waiting for the ship to glide out of the harbor. And pretty soon I found that her brother, yes, was a member of the Order of the Arrow. His name is Mike. Mike Morrison, I think it is, from Utah. And if Mike is as good looking as his sister, he's quite a guy. Our first stop was in Hawaii. And there I had the great pleasure of attending the new Aloha Lodge out of Honolulu at their camp. And we had a great fellowship together. When I got to Melbourne, Australia, I was in visiting the National Secretary of the Boy Scouts of Australia. He said, by all means, go down into the scout shop. You'll want to look things over. And I went down to the scout shop, and the boss man there took me into his private office, and he had a blanket with all sorts of patches on it. But the first thing he pointed to were 3 or 4 Order of the Arrow patches down in Australia. How he got them, I don't know, but there they were in Australia. Well, believe it or not, while I was in Tasmania, the southern island of Australia, the newspaper had a front-page story, strange as it may seem, about the Order of the Arrow. How it got there, I wouldn't like to comment. But there it was, down in Australia, in the little island of Tasmania. Then when we went to England, the home country of scouting, where Baden-Powell started it all, we stayed for a couple of weeks at the wonderful place called the Baden-Powell House, established in memory of Lord Baden-Powell, as a home for all visiting scouters and scouts and cubs from around the world. It was a wonderful experience. As I was looking over the museum, which is in the Baden-Powell House, you can imagine my delight when I saw a beautiful Indian chief's head bonnet contributed by a local lodge of the Order of the Arrow in the USA. While I was there too, I talked with one of the executives of our local council of the Order of the Arrow in Europe. And he told me of a wonderful Order of the Arrow ceremony on the plains of Greece, where our World Jamboree has lately been held. A wonderful Order of the Arrow ceremony in the very shadows of Olympus and the great architectural remains of the Grecian epoch. And then when I was presented to the Queen, for I was presented to the Queen, and she's a lovely lady too, I wore the neckerchief of the Mother Lodge of the Order of the Arrow, and I hope she liked it. I had a little trouble with her husband, I'm sorry to say. Prince Philip was in her train, following along, and I was wearing this neckerchief slide, which Uncle Otto gave me. You remember Uncle Otto, those of you who've been to previous conferences, with the familiar letters BSA upon them. And Prince Philip took a look at it and said, BSA, what's that stand for? I thought he was pretty dumb. But I turned out I didn't understand. In England, there is a great industry known as British Small Arms. And he thought I was advertising the British industry on my uniform. But all around the world, the news of the Order of the Arrow has gone. But now I must get down to my challenges. And I give you several things that have been close to my heart. You'll find them intimated in that table of objectives for our 50th anniversary, which our conference chief has so ably presented to you. When I was in Tasmania, they held the jamboree. They call it a coabboree down there. A jamboree of the Boy Scouts of Australia, right there on that small island. And my old friend Lord Rowan, who had been for many years the chief scout of the British Commonwealth and Empire, but was then governor of Australia, was of course there and made the opening address. In my farewell visit to his office in Government House, we chatted together. We've been friends for many years. We chatted together, we old scouters, as to scouts of yesterday that we knew that had grown to manhood and had made good. And he told me this. He said, some time ago, one of my old scouts turned up, and he said, Chief, I want to thank you for something you said to me. You said to us boys years ago. Why, he said, what was that? He said you were talking to us at a campfire and giving us a bit of advice. And you said these words to us. In heaven's name, be crazy about something. Be crazy about something. He said, you don't know what good that did to me. He said, I had been pursuing a hobby in camp. I like to collect specimens of wildlife. And I'd been pursuing that hobby until the other guys began kidding me about it. But when you said that, in heaven's name, be crazy about something, I knew you were talking to me and advising me to go right ahead. And of course I did. I made it my life study. I threw my life into my hobby. I dedicated myself to it. And Lord Rowan, looking me in the eye, said, and he makes today one of our greatest scientists. Well, that's what I want to say to you, my brothers, this morning. It's related to the theme of our conference, to get the higher vision. In heaven's name, be crazy about something. It has to be something worthwhile, of course. You can't take any old thing and be crazy about it. I must repeat a story which I told in my first report to the National Council of the Boy Scouts of America many years ago, of what happened when I was a young scout executive in the city of brotherly love. That means the city of Philadelphia. I was driving my brass-bound Ford along the streets of the city, and I picked up a young man that wanted to hitchhike. In those days, it was perfectly safe to give a boy a ride if he wanted to hitchhike. And I always asked him whether he were a scout. No, sir, said this boy, I'm not a scout. Well, I said, what do you do with your spare time? Of course, this was about the year 1915, and there weren't too many scouts around in those days. I said, what do you do with your spare time? He said, moving pictures. Moving pictures in 1915? That didn't make sense. The only movies we had in those days, as some of the old geezers behind me here will remember, were called the Nickelodeon. You paid your nickel and you got just a nickel's worth. But I said, you mean you go to the movies? Oh no, he said, I show them in my own cellar. You show them in your cellar. What do you mean you show movies in your cellar? Well, he said, you see, it's this way. My uncle, he is connected with motion pictures. He works for the Censor Bureau. And he brings me all those pieces they cut out, and I show them in the cellar. Well, now, what do you think of that? He was crazy about something, but it was the wrong thing. I commend to you 2 or 3 things that I hope you'll be crazy about and feel able to throw your life into them. as we leave this great conference. Of course, I expect you to be crazy about cheerful service and never lose a smile on your face while you're giving it. Now, our special committee on the 50th anniversary is trying to develop plans for a great national service project for the Order of the Arrow. When it comes along, I just know in my boots that every man jack in the Order of the Arrow is going to be crazy about it and throw himself into it and make it a reality. So I shan't dwell upon that item, save to say that, of course, we're crazy about cheerful service. I want to pass to another subject that is very close to my heart. Be crazy about camping. A few weeks ago, I went back to my old camp again, Treasure Island, and they celebrated the 50th anniversary of that camp, of which I was the first camp director. And you can imagine the emotion that filled me on that occasion. The trees that we planted back then in little saplings were now mighty oaks and maples and deciduous trees of all kinds. The very nature of the terrain had changed considerably, but I pictured in my mind's eye the thousands and thousands of scouts who in those 50 years had done real scouting, genuine camping in their troops on Treasure Island. And so I feel very deeply about this. Now, our National Camp Director, Russ Turner, has passed over to me the record of the last few years in camping on the part of the Scouts of America. And we've done some wonderful things in improving the quantity of it. I have here in my hand the record in 1945 and the record in 1962. Listen to these figures just for a minute. In 1945, 31% of the Boy Scouts of America got to long-term camp. But in 1962, that had been boosted to 43%. In 1945, only 34% of our troops got to long-term camp in the summertime. That had been boosted to 60% in 1962. Maybe we had a little part in that improvement, my brothers. I hope and pray that we did. But there still hangs over my head this morning as I say to you, be crazy about camping, the fact that we still have a job to do there with those 40% of the troops in our councils over America who don't get to a long-term camp, who don't get the fulfillment of the true joy of scouting because of that fact. For them, the handbook, the Boy Scout handbook, has not yet come true if they haven't gotten to camp. It does not come true. And no wonder some of our scouts drop out prematurely because the promise was not lived up to, the promise on the printed page of the Boy Scout handbook. No wonder they drop out. I must tell you at this point a yarn that I heard not many years ago about a little girl who was being prepared by her mother. You don't mind if I talk about a little girl, do you, brother? Thank you. A little girl, 6 years old, was being prepared by her mother for her first party. And her mother said, now, my dear, they will probably have refreshments. And if they pass cake, you take a piece of cake. And if they should pass it the second time, it's all right to take another piece of cake. But if they pass it the third time, you say, no, thank you, I've had plenty. And so the little girl went happily off to the party. And pretty soon, in a couple hours or two, she came dancing and tripping home again, very happy. Her mother said, my dear, did you remember what Mother told you about the cake? Yes, she said, Mommy, I did. She said they passed the cake and I took a nice big piece. And they passed it again and I took another piece. And then they passed it the third time and I said, no, thank you, I've had plenty. But then, Mommy, they passed it the fourth time. And you didn't tell me what to do. Well, the mother said, what did you do? Well, she said, lucky for me, I remember what Daddy sometimes says when you keep shoving the food his way at the table. I just said, take the darn stuff away, I'm sick of it. That, I fear, my brothers, is what some of our brother scouts, not members of the order, have said when their dream of real scouting has not come true because their troop never gets to camp. Be crazy about camping and do something about it, my brothers. Then I want to suggest that we be crazy about our Indian heritage. For we have a great job before us to recompense the early Americans, these first Americans, for some of the injustices done to them in the early history of our country, and maybe even up to the present day. Now I make a confession to you, my brothers. When we started this Order of the Arrow, I was just a little bit skittish about our Indian stuff in the ceremony. Just a little bit cautious about it, for fear we would just be playing Indians like so many kids. Woo, 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 that sort of stuff. But it hadn't worked that way at all. We've done, I think, a magnificent job in many a lodge in going at this business of preserving the culture of our early Americans to the present day. And I want to ask you this morning to undertake, every lodge represented here, in fact every lodge in America, to undertake a genuine study of the native people, the early Americans, in your part of the USA, just as we had demonstrated so ably at our Indian dance performance here in this great arena a few nights ago. Make a serious and worthy study of their culture and their dance and their costume and their mode of life. And then let's bring it all together as a living tribute to these early Americans to pay back some of the debt we owe them. And I'm sure it will be a profitable thing. On my trip around the world, we saw what some other parts of the world have been doing in that respect. And I'm happy to say one of those places is in our 50th state. I love Hawaii. I've been there 3 times. I'm so glad from the bottom of my heart that the Order of the Arrow is there, because it belongs there. Because they have discovered the meaning of the word brotherhood in Hawaii. I arrived there at the beginning of what they call Aloha Week, when they give a whole week over to the celebrating of the ancient cultures of the early Hawaiians. They re-elect the king and the queen. They have all sorts of pageantry. They make come alive again the early customs of the native Hawaiian. And when I got to New Zealand, the same thing was true with respect to the Maori people, the Aboriginal tribes of those two great islands called New Zealand in the South Pacific. They give them great respect. When I went into the House of Parliament of New Zealand in the city of Wellington, there was a Maori room decorated with their own art. There were portraits of great statesmen, Maori statesmen, who had share in the government of that nation, the nation of New Zealand in the British Commonwealth. And it was a great demonstration of how brotherhood can come true if we make it come true. Now, while on our trip, I saw a great movie I want to recommend to you. Maybe some of you have already seen it. I mention it now because it illustrates what you can do if you become crazy about such a thing as I am now recommending to you. I'm talking about the movie called Lawrence of Arabia. How many of you have seen it? Then you know maybe something I'm talking about. But it made such an impression upon me that I went back and read again Lowell Thomas's book, Lawrence of Arabia. And I was perfectly amazed to read again how one small-sized, quiet-spoken, shy, young man, no older than some of you who represent local lodges here today, was able to do for an Aboriginal people in the peninsula of Arabia in the time of World War I. And the reason he was able to do such a miracle was because he made himself one with the Bedouin tribes of Arabia. Let me read this paragraph to you from Lowell Thomas's book. Speaking of Lawrence, he says, during his 7 years wandering through the desert, dressing like an Arab, living with the Arabs in their tents, observing their customs, talking to them in their own dialects, and he studied their own language, riding on his camel across a broad expanse of lonely country, unbroken except by the long purple line of the horizon, lying under a silent dome of the stars, Thomas Edward Lawrence drank the cup of Arabian wisdom and absorbed the spirit of the nomad people. Now, what was the result of all that? Listen to this paragraph. I was never so impressed by any paragraph in any book outside the Holy Bible as I have been by this experience of a young man named Lawrence. Lord Kitchener's advice and his own personal observation led Lawrence to believe that a crash was imminent, a crash just prior to the development of World War I. When it came, he at once attempted to enlist as a private in the rank of Kitchener's army. But members of the Army Medical Board looked at the frail, 5'3", tow-headed youth, winked at one another, and told him to run home to his mother and wait until the next war. Listen, just 4 years after he had been turned down as physically fit for the ranks, this young Oxford graduate, small of stature, shy and scholarly as ever, entered Damascus at the head of his victorious Arabian army. Imagine what the members of the medical board would have said if someone had suggested to them in 1914 that 3 or 4 years later this same young man would decline knighthood and the ranks of a general and would even avoid the coveted Victoria Cross. Be crazy about something. And I hope one thing you will be crazy about is your interest in our own Aboriginal people, the first Americans. Now, I have just one more suggestion to make to you, my brothers, as I close this challenge. And it grows out of what I have just said to you. Be crazy about brotherhood. For that's what we are trying to develop among ourselves, yes, but in larger dimensions round the world.